mother never thought, except for Clara, who continued to peer at the horizon, top of 144. After a week, with no word from the flying uncle, the people began to speculate that he had gone so high that he had disappeared into outer space, and the ignorant suggested that he would reach the moon. With a mixture of sadness and relief, Severo decided that his brother-in-law and his machine must have fallen into some hidden crevice of the Cordillera, where they would never be found. In other words, he's dead. Neva wept disconsolately and lit candles to San Antonio, patron of lost objects. Severo opposed the idea of having masses said because he did not believe in them as a way of getting into heaven, much less of returning to earth. And he maintained that masses and religious vows, like the selling of indulgences, images, scrapulars, were a dishonest business. Because of his attitude, Navera and Nana and the children say the rosary behind their father's back for 9 days. Meanwhile, groups of volunteer explorers and mountain climbers tirelessly search peaks and passes, combing every accessible stretch of land until they finally returned in triumph to hand the family the mortal remains of the deceased in a sealed black coffin. So let's write it down. Now we're back to the beginning of the story, right? Oh, so this explains why Uncle Marcos is in a black coffin. He went for a little flight on his magic bird, and he didn't make it. The intrepid traveler was laid to rest in a grandiose funeral. His death made him a hero, and his name was on the front page of all the papers for several days. The same multitude that had gathered to see him off the day he flew away in his bird paraded past his coffin. The entire family wept, as befit the occasion, except for Clara, who continued to watch the sky with the patience of an astronomer. Now again, more magical realism. Clara knows that Uncle Marcos is not actually dead. 1 week after he had been buried, Uncle Marcos, a bright smile playing behind his pirate's mustache, appeared in person in the doorway of Neva and Serrano Deval's house. Thanks to the surreptitious prayers of the women and children, as he himself admitted, he was alive and well and in full possession of his faculties, including his sense of humor. Despite the noble lineage of his aerial maps, the flight had been a failure. He'd lost his airplane and had to return on foot. But he had not broken any bones, and his adventurous spirit was intact. This confirmed the family's eternal devotion to San Antonio, who was not taken as a warning by future generations who also tried to fly, although by different means. Legally, however, Marcos was a corpse. Note the irony of this, right? He's been buried, so obviously he's dead, he's a corpse. Serval de Valle was obligated to use all his legal ingenuity to bring his brother-in-law back to life and the full rights of citizenship. When the coffin was pried open in the presence of the appropriate authorities, it was found to contain a bag of sand. This discovery ruined the reputation, up till then untarnished, of the volunteer explorers and mountain climbers, who from that day on were considered little better than a pack of bandits. Marcos, I'm on page 145, first paragraph. Marcos' heroic resurrection, right, the coming back to life, made everyone forget about his barrel organ phase. Again, note the humor and the irony. Once again, he was sought after guest in all the city salons, and at least for a while, his name was cleared. Marcos stayed in his sister's house for several months. One night, he left without saying goodbye. So again, we're on to the next story. By the way, let's just point out the genius of how Allende likes to do this. Notice that she will put her topic sentences in the middle of her paragraphs. Did you see this? So for example, we're told, okay, he comes back, he's resurrected, now he's back from the dead, everybody's a celebrity again, and then all of a sudden we get just a line in the middle of a paragraph that says, and then one morning he decides he's ready to go on a next adventure. By the way, at 3A, let's make an observation. Allende is of course playing in a very famous tradition. Who is the most famous explorer of them all? Who is the guy who goes on all of the adventures and his name becomes the name of what we call explorers and adventurers of all kinds? Of course, we call an adventure today an odyssey. The reason we call it an odyssey is because of a cat named Odysseus. Who did what? He was defined by what? Going on all these crazy adventures, right? Okay, and so Uncle Marcos is in some ways a kind of, modern day, if you will, Odysseus going on all of his adventures. All right, we're back to the reading on 145. One night, he left without saying goodbye, leaving behind his trunks, his books, his weapons, his boots, all his belongings. Severo and even Neva herself breathed a sigh of relief. Everybody's like, finally, he's gone. His visit had gone on too long, but Clara was so upset that she spent a week walking in her sleep and sucking her thumb. Again, more magical realism examples. The little girl, who was only 7 at the time, had learned to read from her uncle's storybooks and been closer to him than any other member of the family because of her prophesying power. So here we go, next magical realism. Clara can tell the future, all right? She can see the future, all right? Marcos maintained that his niece's gift would be a source of income and a good opportunity for him to cultivate his own clairvoyance. In other words, they both can tell the future. He believed that all human beings possessed this ability, particularly his own family, and that if it did not function well, it was simply due to a lack of training. He bought a crystal ball in the Parisian bazaar, insisting that it had magic powers and was from the East, although it was later found to be part of a buoy from a fishing boat. Set it down on a background of black velvet and announced that he would tell people's fortunes, cure the evil eye, and improve the quality of dreams, all for the modest sum of 5 sedantos. His first customers were the maids from around the neighborhood. One of them had been accused of stealing because her employer had misplaced a valuable ring. The crystal ball revealed the exact location of the object in question. It had rolled beneath a wardrobe. The next day, there was a line outside the front door of the house. There were coachmen, shopkeepers, and milkmen. Later, a few municipal employees and distinguished ladies made a discreet appearance, slinking along the side walls of the house to keep from being recognized. The customers were received by Nana, who ushered them into the waiting room and collected their fees. This task kept her busy throughout the day and demanded so much of her time that the family began to complain that all there ever was for dinner was old string beans and jellied quince. Marcos decorated the carriage house with some frayed curtains that had once belonged to the drawing room, but at that neglect and age had turned into dusty rags. Then he and Clara received the customers. The two divines, people who can tell the future, wore tunics, color of the men of light, as Marcos called the yellow color. Nana had dyed them with saffron powder, boiling them in pots, usually reserved for rice and pasta. In addition to this tunic, Marcos wore a turban around his head and an Egyptian amulet around his neck. Every one of these stories about Marcos, notice that what he wears is always kind of like crazy, almost clown-like, right? He had grown a beard, let his hair grow long. He was thinner than ever before. Marcos and Clara were utterly convincing, especially because the child had no need to look into the crystal ball to guess what her clients wanted to hear. She would whisper in her Uncle Marcos's ear, again, more magical realism. She actually can read people's minds and know the future. And in turn, would transmit the message to the client along with any improvisations of his own that he thought pertinent. Thus, their fame spread because all those who arrived, sad and bedraggled at the consulting room, left filled with hope. Unrequited lovers were told how to win over indifferent hearts, and the poor left with foolproof tips on how to place their money at the dog tracks. Business grew so prosperous that the waiting room was always packed with people, and Nana began to suffer dizzy spells from being on her feet so many hours a day. This time, Surveyor had no need to intervene to put a stop to his brother-in-law's venture. For both Marcos and Clara, realizing that their unerring guesses would alter the fate of their clients, who always followed their advice to the letter, became frightened and decided that this was a job for swindlers. They abandoned their carriage house oracle, split the profits, and even though the only one who had cared about the material side of things had been Nana. Of all the Duvalier children, Clara was the one with the greatest interest in and stamina for her uncle's stories. She could repeat each and every one of them. She knew by heart words from several dialects of the Indians, was acquainted with their customs, and could describe the exact way in which they pierced their lips and earlobes with wooden shafts, their initiation rites, the names of the most poisonous snakes, and the appropriate anecdotes for each. Her uncle was so eloquent that the child could feel in her own skin the burning sting of snake bites, see reptiles slide across the carpet between the legs of the Jacaranda room divider, and hear the shrieks of Marcos behind the drawing room drapes. She did not hesitate as she recalled Lupe de Agore's search for El Dorado, or the unpronounceable names of the flora and fauna her extraordinary uncle had seen. She knew about the llamas who take salt tea with their yak lard, and she could give detailed descriptions of the opulent women of Tahiti and the rice fields of China, or the white prairies of the north, where the eternal ice kills animals and men who lose their ways, turning them to stone in seconds. Marcos had various travel journals in which he recorded his excursions and impressions, as well as a collection of maps and books of stories and fairy tales, and he kept them in the trunks he stored in the junk room at the far end of the third courtyard. From there, they were hauled out to inhabit the dreams of his descendants until they were mistakenly burned half a century later on an infamous pyre. Just pause for a moment and point out, this maybe makes you think at 3B, who's the greatest storyteller in your life? Jot it down. Who's the one that can tell a story and it can either freak you out or it can make you laugh or whatever? Who in your life is the person that best can tell a story? And then, of course, the 3B question, are you a good storyteller? Can you tell a good story? Notice Uncle Marcos loves to tell his stories to Clara. Clara's the only one that really pays much attention, but she loves it. She loves all of it. She can somehow go to another place with all of these stories. And of course, he has left behind all this other stuff. Now, I'm on page 147, last paragraph. Now, Marcos had returned from his last journey in a coffin. So now we'll get back to it. Oh, so this is a different coffin. This is the second time he's been buried, right? Now we're back to the beginning of the story. He had died of a mysterious African plague that had turned him as yellow and wrinkled as a piece of parchment. When he realized he was ill, he set out for home with the hope that his sister's ministrations and Dr. Carrizza's knowledge would restore his health and youth. But he was unable to withstand the 60 days on ship and died at the latitude of Guayaquil, ravaged by fever, hallucinating about musky women and hidden treasure. The captain of the ship, an Englishman by the name of Longfellow, was about to throw him overboard, wrapped in a flag. But Marcos, despite his savage appearance and his delirium, had made so many friends on board and seduced so many women that passengers prevented him from doing so, and Longfellow was obliged to store the body side by side with the vegetables of the Chinese cook to preserve it from the heat and the mosquitoes of the tropics until the ship's carpenter had time to improvise a coffin. At El Calalo, they obtained a more appropriate container, and several days later the captain, furious at all the troubles this passenger had caused the shipping company and himself personally, unloaded him without a backward glance, surprised that not a soul was there to receive the body or cover the expenses he had incurred. Later he learned that the post office in those latitudes were not as reliable as that far-off England, and that all his telegrams had vaporized en route. Again, more magical realism. Or joking about the problems of mail, right? Fortunately for Longfellow, a customs lawyer who was a friend of the de Valle family appeared and offered to take charge, placing Marcos and all his paraphernalia in a freight car, which he shipped to the capital to only known address of the deceased, his sister's house. Okay, so let's pause for a moment now and just make a quick observation at level 1. This is a story about what? Like if somebody were to ask you, okay, dude, you did, what would you do in 3 Oh, we read this story called Uncle Marcos. Really? What's it about? Jot down one line about what this story is about. Well, you could say, it's really a story about stories, isn't it? It's really a story about a character. It's really a story about a guy named Uncle Marcos and all the crazy stuff that he's done. Jot down for you your favorite crazy thing at level 1 that he did. Was it for you when he tries to get the girl by creating that organ grinder with his parrot that can speak Spanish, and he's singing to her outside of a window when she's having a get-together with her pals? How about maybe it's that bird story where he tries to fly off with the bird, right? For some of you, maybe it's his ability to try and tell the future and fool people, right? Whatever that one is, okay? At level 2A, what are possible messages and themes here? Well, there's several that we could probably jot down. For example, 1, we could make the observation that storytelling is always fun if you have a good character to tell a story about, right? That's what makes this story so much fun, is that you got this crazy guy. What's our word? Eccentric. Eccentric. It means different from other kinds of people, right? You got this crazy guy who loves to have adventures in the world, and he loves to come back and he loves to share those adventures, right? Number 2, of course, this is another major message or theme. Sometimes the same person can embarrass some people and really entertain other people, right? So, for example, the adults in Uncle Marcos' life are like, oh my goodness, the relatives. Oh my goodness, you're embarrassing us again. Of course, the young girl, Clara, she's just like, I love this about this guy. He's so much fun and he's never boring. He's never boring. He's a lot of fun. Number 3, and finally, for themes messages here. Obviously, one of the major themes messages of the story is old men ought to be explorers, is the line of T.S. Eliot from Four Quartets. Notice Uncle Marcos. He leaves on another journey. He is just like Odysseus. We'll talk about that at 3A in a bit. But he loves to go on journeys. We'll think about Alfred Lord Tennyson's classic poem Ulysses, that will play that same game. I cannot rest from travels, I will drink life to the lees, a 3A observation. You'll study that text with me in your senior year. It's available as well on LearnStrong.net if you want to watch it before you get to be a senior. At 2B, well, we obviously are dealing with a character who is clearly a round character. Now, whether he is a complex character or a static character, you get to debate. Right? Does he change? Does he evolve? Does he grow over time? Well, you could make the argument that the fact that he tries things and they don't work, and then he's got to figure out the next big thing that he's going to do, suggests a sense of evolution or growing, right? In other words, a dynamic character, as opposed to a static character. Let's talk as well at 2B. We've mentioned it already, just say it one more time. This idea of magical realism. If you like these kinds of stories, then I would say go online, type in magical realism, and just start reading all of the amazing stories that are a part of this type or genre of writing, okay? And it is fun. What makes it fun? Let's write it down at either 2B or at 3B. What is it that makes this kind of writing fun? Well, it doesn't take itself too seriously. It is aware that, of course, it's telling stories that you're going to roll your eyes and go, yeah, right, whatever. And yet there's enough realism in the story that this is not science fiction or anything like that, right? But there's enough elements in the story that entertains. And, of course, as many readers have said, you can't help but read this story and use your imagination. To see Marcos dressed all up in his strange garments, doing his crazy, right? Dressed up with his goggles on and his bird trying to fly off, and he actually does it and all of that. All right, let's work level 3. How are we going to relate this to other texts? Well, I've already mentioned several, right? Homer's Odyssey is clearly standing at the back of this story, and the whole kind of person of Odysseus, or in his Latinate version, Ulysses. The great poet Tennyson, the great British poet, wrote a famous poem about this Ulysses, where he says that, I cannot rest from travels, I will drink life to the lees. That is to say for you, what is your favorite text about adventurers, right? The people who go on adventures. Do you have TV shows about people who like to go off to all kinds of parts of the world, and they like to try the cuisine, and they like to do things and travel? Of course, at 3B, let's finish with this question. What is your view about a couple of things? What is your view about travel? About seeing the world? Do you imagine that when you get old, you will be the kind of person that kind of sits and, kind of retires and watches Vanna turn letters on TV and kind of drink strained asparagus and wait to die? Do you kind of see yourself that way? Or do you see yourself more like Uncle Marcos, a guy that says, oh, no, I got one more adventure. Let's go, let's go. In other words, notice he dies on an adventure, right? He dies on an adventure. Number 2 for 3B. Who for you? We've asked this already. What is your favorite story about an adventure? In your family, do you have anybody like this who's gone on adventures and done things and tried to see other parts of the world and that kind of thing? What motivates you maybe in your family? Do you have somebody who's kind of eccentric? Somebody who embarrasses some people, but you love it. You love the fact that he kind of shows up or she shows up and does crazy, all right? Well, there you go. Finally, of course, we'll ask this question. Why are these two stories linked together? So let's finish with that one. Walter Mitty and Uncle Marcos are brought together. Of course, characterization plays a role. Of course, imagination plays a role. Mitty and Uncle Marcos are both characters who very much enjoy adventure. Mitty, of course, only in his mind. He's never actually having those adventures. Uncle Marcos, he goes on those adventures and he enjoys them very much. Of course, both of the stories challenge us to imagine what it's like to live in a world of the imagination, right? All right, well, there you go. An introduction to both those texts and Uncle Marcos especially. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.